pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, pawn a6, bishop a4, knight f6, pawn d3, pawn d6, pawn c3, bishop e7, knight b1, d2, castles kingside, knight f1, pawn b5, bishop b3, pawn d5, queen e2, pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, bishop e6, bishop takes e6, pawn takes e6, knight g3, queen d7, castles kingside, rook a8, d8, pawn a4, queen d3, queen takes d3, rook takes d3, pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5, rook a6, rook d6, king h1, knight d7, bishop e3, rook d8, pawn h3, pawn h6, rook f1, a1, knight d7, b8, rook a8, rook d1, king h2, rook takes a1, rook takes a1, knight d7, pawn b4, king f7, knight f1, bishop d6, pawn g3, knight f6, knight f1, d2, king e7, rook a6, knight b8, rook a5, pawn c6, king g2, knight b8, d7, king f1, rook c8, knight e1, knight e8, knight d3, knight c7, pawn c4, pawn takes c4, knight takes c4, knight b5, rook a6, king f6, bishop c1, bishop b8, bishop b2, pawn c5, knight b6, Knight takes b6. Rook takes b6. Pawn c4. Knight c5. Pawn c3. Bishop c1. Knight d4. Knight d7. King e7. Knight takes b8. Knight b3. Rook b7. King d8. Rook d7. King e8. Rook takes g7. Rook takes b8. Rook takes b8. Knight takes b8. Knight b3. Bishop a3. Pawn c2. Knight c6.